Thanks so much for coming to the PLC webinar series, webinar number 1. We're going to be talking about effective teaming, all the routines, working agreements, protocols that we use for data use. First and foremost, we'd like to thank the New Hampshire Department of Education. They are the sponsors of this particular webinar series, so we are allowed to bring this to you for free. We really enjoy our relationship and partnership with them, and we're glad to be here today to be able to give you this information. Everyone is muted. Please ask questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom screen. In the webinar format, it's a little bit tricky when people raise their hands. If you have a lot of questions, we might be able to do it at the end when there's less people on, but for the most part, we ask that you write them in the Q&A and we will get to them. I have my colleague, Marissa Hooper, is going to be presenting with me today, so we'll feed the questions to each other as we go whenever we can. The information from this particular webinar, so the PowerPoint or slides and your PD certificate, they'll all be sent to you in an email. It's roughly 24 hours from the end of this webinar. You will be receiving an email that will have all the links and everything you need for it. So yes, you will get a PD certificate. Just hold tight till about 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. That's when the Zoom will kick off the email for you folks. At the end, there'll be a brief survey. We'll remind you, we really value your feedback, so please take a moment to answer. I think there's 4 or 5 questions that will help us as we move through this particular series. So for today, I'm Heather Jenkins. My colleague Marissa Hooper is also going to be presenting today.
Hi, everyone.
And then Kristen Crawford is also a Department of Education contact. She, I don't believe, is able to be here today on this webinar, but we have her contact information at the end of this presentation if you ever want to get a hold of her. The key understanding, this is for the full series. So all of these targets are what you're going to learn through the 4 webinars that we have scheduled for this PLC series. So first and foremost, we want you to understand high functioning professional learning communities and that they're about student and adult learning. So it's not just looking at data for student learning and figuring out what we're going to do for particular students, but it's also about learning ourselves through the process of looking at data and figuring out peer-to-peer conversations and meetings that we have with our colleagues. Another one of the key understandings of this series is to understand the process and responsibilities of educators in a professional learning community cycle. So professional learning communities are not just meetings, they're a way of being. So part of these, this way of being and having this culture is to go through different cycles of professional learning and for understanding student data. And then we also want to talk about the implementation of consistent systems to create those high functioning professional learning communities and having that culture of collaboration in your schools. So that's the whole thing. For today, we are going to be talking about specifically today what makes highly functional teams. This is an integral part of being able to have a culture of collaboration and to have those professional learning communities in your schools. We're going to talk about how we define professional learning communities, just to make sure we're all on the, sort of same page and understanding what we mean by PLC. And we're going to show you a little bit of how to get started with those practices and to be able to sustain this work throughout the year and for years to come. So here's where we're having our first webinar today. Just a heads up, these are when the next dates are for the next webinars. If you signed up for this one and you want to go to the series, you have to sign up for each one because sometimes people sign up for just one because they just need a little refresher. So make sure you sign up for all of them if you're looking to do the full series. And for our agenda today, we're going to be building that common definition of PLCs. We're going to talk about creating effective teams. We're going to go through a whole cycle of PLC just so you can get the kind of high level understanding of what we mean by PLC cycles. And then we're going to give you some tools to get started. So first and foremost, when we talk about building a common definition of PLCs, we have all of these things on our plates, right? We're doing all of these things as educators, and we want to just make sure that we are taking the time to figure out how we can best serve our students. I'm realizing I need to stop my video so that you can see maybe a little bit more of the screen and so that we're not covering everything up. So this is us as educators right now. When we're talking about PLC, there are three big ideas of PLC. First and foremost, we're looking at ensuring that all students learn, right? We're creating that culture of collaboration within our schools and our districts, and we're going to be focusing on data and results. Just a little bit more information about these. First, that ensuring that all students learn. Here's where, a shift in education was years and years ago of the shifting from that thought of, I taught the kids, that's all I need to do, I'm moving on, it's up to them to be able to learn it. We need to, as educators, have sort of those safeguards and those, checkpoints where we're saying, are these students learning it? And if they aren't, what do I need to do to encourage them or to help them learn? It is a lot of shifts that are sort of taking place in ensuring that those students learn and that they're also continuing to have those sort of high standards. We don't want to lower those standards. So we want to really be looking at what it is that we can do in our practices and talking with our peers to make sure that all students are learning and figuring out how to meet the needs of all of our students. Creating a culture of collaboration. So this is not just, if you're in elementary school, not just your grade level teams. If you're a middle school, again, not just your grade level teams or your specific content area teams, but we're looking at creating a culture and a system in which we're working basically on our own and together to make sure that we're analyzing the impact of our teaching and ensuring that those students are improving and learning what we have been putting in front of them in the classroom. So that collaboration, when we talk about PLC throughout this whole webinar series, we're going to be looking at how we can collaborate with our peers and how we can kind of get out of that siloed classroom and, closing our door and opening it up and understanding how we can work with our peers to ensure that best practices are being done within all of our classrooms and that there is equity and understanding. So as students are learning, so are we as educators. With the creating that culture of a collaboration, I just alluded to it just a second ago about like not being siloed in our classrooms. We have to get out of the mentality that these are my students, those are their students. It is not a go ask special ed because they're a special ed student. It's not go ask, a specific specialist about a teacher. It is, if they're in our school, it is the responsibility of the entire school community to ensure that all students are learning. So we start to, if we're in a grade level, if I teach fourth grade, as a fourth grade team, we're ensuring that we are meeting the needs of all students and that I am helping my colleagues and my colleagues are helping me, and we're working together to make sure all of those students are succeeding. In addition, we want to tap into our colleagues because we know that they have a lot to offer. We all have a lot to offer each other. If we could, sort of get out of our classrooms, a lot of schools are going to that peer observation model and being able to go observe peers in other classrooms or having peers come into our classrooms to be able to observe what we're doing. That's one of the greatest ways for professional growth for our teachers is having that, peer-to-peer observations and collaborative discussions that are allowing us to work together as a whole rather than separately, so that are always kind of honing in our craft. And then the next one is really when all team members contribute, the quality of the work is better. So this is sort of one of those, I've talked at a couple of workshops and on site about one of the, a teacher had the students do a specific activity. It seemed very simple. It was, you need to go into the hallway that had a bunch of balloons that had different numbers on them, and you had to find all of the particular balloons with your number on them. The kids went out into the hallway. Nobody found all the balloons with their number. After 10 minutes, they went back into their classroom, and then the teacher changed the assignment in that she talked about, rather than you going to find your number, everybody write your number on a piece of paper, put it on yourself or whatever. And then they started handing each other balloons because they said, oh, this is yours. Who's number 10? They're holding them up. And within like 2 minutes, the kids were back into the classroom and had completed the task. Now, those are students. That's an activity where students are in the hallway. However, it works the same when we work together as teachers. We're always more effective when we are working together than when we're working separately. The last part of this is to focus on results. So we're looking at data, right? Relevant data. We have no shortage of data. We just want to make sure that it's relevant and that if we are assessing students, they were actually using that data for a specific purpose, right? And so we're going to be taking a look at data, using that data to help inform our instruction and to make improvements. When it comes to PLC, we have 4 driving questions of PLC. What do we want our students to learn? How will we know if they've learned it? What will we do if they haven't? And what will we do if they have learned it? So anytime we're thinking about our instruction, we're constantly thinking about these particular questions. Specifically, what do we want our students to learn? A lot of times we figure what we want our students to learn is if we have a program, we follow that program, whatever that program is saying we want students to learn is what we're hoping they learn. We do the assessment and we move on from there. We want to be a little bit more systematic than that. We want to make sure that we have our learning objectives. We want to know what the target is at the end. So we just don't want to turn the pages of our books. We want to really start looking at what do we have for our learning objectives and how are we getting there? How do we know when students are getting it and how do we know when they're not? This is a particular graphic that we created about what a year-long sort of roadmap or what professional learning communities could look like throughout the year. We're establishing teams. We're going to create that year-long goal. We're going to have some SMART goals, some instructional cycles, and we're going to reflect throughout the whole process and celebrate at the end. We're going to talk a little bit more about what a PLC cycle is, not particularly in this webinar, so we're just kind of giving you an overview here. When it comes to professional learning communities, this is just the graphic that goes along with. It's not just a specific grade level, it's vertical teams, it's the whole school that is looking and working together. They have a shared purpose, a shared vision. They are all fully committed and they have shared goals that is ensuring that all students are making progress and making gains. And we're doing everything we can to work together to make sure that that happens. When we look at PLCs and when a school adopts sort of that PLC mindset and framework, this is just a general these are graphics of, this is real data of a school that did not have that culture of collaboration, was not looking at data very often. And this is how their particular testing over the years completely rose. And they basically went from one of the lowest performing schools in the state to a blue ribbon school over a specific number of years. This is back in the day. They were doing PLC really when the DeFores started coming out with PLC, and they had specific protocols that they were using. They looked at data in a systematic way, and it made huge improvements. And we've seen this over and over and over again. So what we're presenting to you now is that same sort of philosophy of having those protocols and systematic approach, but we're going to be doing it with a little bit of an updated feel to it. So the common definition that we have here is, again, educators, the word collaboration and working collaboratively is something that is essential to PLC. And we're looking at growth and achievement and making sure that we are doing the most we can to get the most amount of growth for the students that we serve. Any questions at this point, Marissa?
Not so far.
Okay, thank you. All right. First things first, when we are creating a culture of collaboration and really thinking about PLCs, we need to have effective teams. So I wanted to talk a little bit about creating effective teams. That's one of the first things we do. Now, each year we talk about who's going to be in which team. So it depends on your school, the way that teams are going to be. But basically, these are people that are working together interdependently, and they're mutually accountable, and they're going towards the same goal. So when we talk about teaming, we can't not talk about John Hattie. I'm sure that most of you have seen the data that he has put together. If you haven't, he's done thousands of studies. He has an updated, book out about collective teacher efficacy and visible learning for students, and having students make the most amount of growth as possible for the year's worth of work that they're doing. Specifically now, this is very timely because we have a lot of students that are coming in lower. So we want to make sure that we're bringing them along and having them at least make 1 year's worth of growth, if not more, to be able to catch up. Good news is if we look at this, some of you might be used to a model that's kind of like a half circle for the Hattie effect. This is the updated visual for that. But up at the top here is collective teacher efficacy, which means everybody working together towards a common goal and ensuring that students have a high level of expectations for them. We're not going to lower our expectations just so that students meet them. We're going to continue to have high expectations. We're going to work together, and we're going to make sure that everybody is on board and part of that sort of puzzle that needs to be put together to make sure that all students are learning. If you do this well and you work together well and everybody's working towards that common goal, right here it tells you the amount of growth that students can make when you're doing this properly, and that's over 1.5 years worth of growth for 1 year's worth of work. So collective teacher efficacy and working in sort of that framework of PLC is going to be really beneficial and going to bring your students where they need to be. When we talk about teaming structures, you could have grade level teams. So a lot of times elementary schools and sometimes middle school have grade level teams. The other one might be content area teams. So anybody who teaches math, science, social studies, reading, writing, whatever it may be, your specials, your CTE, whatever it is. And then a lot of times we also want to look at vertical teams, especially when we're sort of thinking all the time about grade level teams. We want to look vertically as well, because if we work in a specific grade level for too long, we forget what's before us and what comes after us. So those vertical teams can be super helpful as well. And then you can have school or district teams. So there's not one particular team that is a quote unquote PLC. Again, it's more of a way of thinking. It's more of a way of doing. things. So any of these structures can have that collaborative nature to them, be looking at data and continuing to improve our instruction and student learning. When we talk about components of successful teams, there's 5 different components. And we're just going to go quickly through these. First one is agreements, roles, and climate. If we don't have a good climate, if we don't have an open sort of thought process throughout whatever type of team that we're on, then we're in a little bit of trouble, right? So a lot of times those defined agreements or those norms that we create are going to help us become effective teams. We want people to have different roles within that team, and we want to have that positive culture and climate. Those agreements and roles help people stay engaged. They help people know what's coming. They create sort of a safe environment for folks because they know that when they go to a specific meeting, that this is what's going to be happening. This is the way things are working. The agreements or those norms should be reviewed at the beginning of any meeting. So if you create norms that say we begin and end on time, or there's no side conversations, those are really good to review beforehand to keep people top of mind for what the goals are at hand. And the roles that people have can be static, they can stay the same, or they can rotate through. So we'll talk a little bit about this here. When we talk about creating agreements or establishing agreements, again, these are sort of your norms. Some of the things that you can take into consideration is, who's making the decision making, what your expectations are, how we can get people to participate. This is just an example. One thing that I would say, if you are an administrator and you are trying to roll out the PLC model and have your teams be working more collaboratively, I would not recommend saying these are the 4 norms that every single or agreements that every single team is going to have, because teams are different, the dynamics are different. So some teams may need other agreements that other teams may not. One of the ones specifically that I can think of is multitasking, right? There are some teams that don't need a norm that says no multitasking. They just don't. They're in there, they do what they need to do. But you take a look at the makeup of your particular group, and then you all come together and you create the agreements or norms together to be able to make it a little bit easier and a little bit more fluid for folks to be able to come in and know what they need to do. So those can change. They don't need to stay the same all the time. I wouldn't suggest changing them all the time, but as your teams change and people change in your team, your norms or working agreements may change. Here's just again, some of the examples that you might have for your agreements or your norms. And then there's, because PLC has a lot of protocols, we've created the agreements that you can put on a page. It can also go at the top of a note-taking template, which is where I would suggest that you have them. But we have, again, a little protocol for you to be able to do and to have folks be able to create their norms for each particular team. When it comes to roles and responsibilities, these are just some examples of roles that tend to be needed in a team environment. Again, these roles can stay the same. They can, you can rotate them maybe every 6 months. If you find that somebody on your team took on a role that maybe is not necessarily something that they're as good at as we all thought, or that they might not be comfortable with, you can definitely switch it up. I always give the example, I was a note taker the first time that we created sort of looking at collaborative teams in one of my schools. I am not a good note taker. So I was not a note taker for very long. I started moving on to facilitator. I did that for a number of years, and then we switched up the facilitator, and it was great because our team ended up being even more worked a lot better and had a little bit different feel once we had a different facilitator. So we ended up being even more effective with a different facilitator. So it's good to be able to kind of mix it up a little bit as well. The next thing we talk about is consistent protocols. Protocols, why we use them, helps us remain outcome oriented and super efficient. Again, that predictable environment where folks know this is what we're going to follow, this is how we're going to look at data, this is how we're going to be doing our team meetings, whatever it is. It also keeps us on track so that we can make sure that we have this process that is rigorous, that we're doing everything we can to improve our teaching and student learning, and it keeps us accountable. This is one of the protocols that we'll be talking about. During the second webinar, we're going to go into detail with the data-driven dialogue, but this is just an example of one of the protocols. This is also another protocol that we have that's a PLC team assessment. We like to do these a few times a year just so that people can understand where they are as a team and where they might be able to go and how they might be able to improve. The next part here is the shared and measurable goals. All right, so we want to articulate our goals. So these are measurable. They help us follow through with things and they help us be more effective. We want to have that common understanding about what we are doing and where we are moving to and sort of keep our eye on the prize with these goals. We want to revisit them often, right? They can be revised. And if we find that we're meeting a specific goal or we need to change a goal, that's fine, but they have to exist and we have to continuously look at them. They have to be clear and they have to be measurable. If we can't measure them, we can't just say kids are going to get better at whatever it is. We have to say how much better. So we'll be talking about goal setting. That'll be during the third webinar, but those measurable goals are going to be essential for the success of any sort of collaborative team that you have. And they have to be meaningful, challenging, which is a big one, challenging, and they also have to be achievable, right? If we know we can't achieve it, don't put it as a goal. We want to make something that's really achievable. All right. Here's a year-long SMART goal template. Again, we'll be talking about this in our third webinar, but we just wanted to show you the protocol here. This is, again, action steps. So these are all protocols that we have to be able to help you ensure that you're being as rigorous and as effective as possible. Accountability is one of those sort of cringing words that I hear, I feel like sometimes, but accountability, just making sure that we're all doing what we can to be able to make sure that this is successful. So your building or district administrators need to be present. They need to be part of this. This can't be just a, seventh grade math team making this work for everybody, right? So we need to make sure that leadership is on board. We need to understand that leadership needs to help us be effective, but they also need to hear what we have to say as educators in the building and understand how they can help us as well. If building leaders can't be part of the teaming structure or go to the team meetings, then what ends up happening is we should have a note-taking template and they should be able to be looking at that note-taking template so that everybody's on the page all the time to make sure that we're all supporting each other. Again, that's the note-taking template. If it's uploaded where everybody can see it and everything's there, then whether I miss a meeting or whether my administrator needs to know where we are, everybody is understanding where we are in a specific process of data collection, where we are with instruction for our students. Super helpful for our specialists as well, because they're often not able to be part of any sort of grade level or team, like a content area team. So it's good for them to be able to see what's going on in the classroom, and those note-taking templates can be helpful for that. And then those note-taking protocols can help us make sure that we're doing that. This is one of the protocols for accountability. It's a PLC cycle checklist, and you kind of go through it. We'll be talking about this in just a little bit. Here's an example of a note-taking template. And then the last thing is define timelines. So many times we say we're going to look at data and we say, oh gosh, we can't do it this week. Let's do it next week. Okay, next week comes along. Oh, this is fire we need to put out. We need to do this. And it goes on to the next week. We need to have those defined timelines to make sure that we're completing what we need to, we're communicating what we need to. Obviously, they're somewhat flexible. We don't necessarily need to go to the specific, exact day, but we want to make sure that we're getting through what we need to and looking at the data to say, what do we need to do next? It's good to have a shared calendar or common information where we know all the expectations of who should be where, when. Everybody knows what they're a part of and how they can help. And it helps us make sure that we're making the most out of our meeting time. And it's not like, oh, was special ed supposed to be at this one? I'm not sure. Oh, were they? Okay. So that clear communication plan helps us meet our goals. We're looking, you might have a working document that you're looking at with the communication. It includes all team member information and the activities, and we want to make sure that we're communicating it to everybody. This note-taking template, again, is something that can be super helpful, or you might have a shared calendar in Google where you have specifically, this is what we're doing on which dates, specific people are invited, and everybody knows what they need to be doing for that. This is what building administrators need to do to be able to make sure that that PLC and that collaborative environment is happening. So we want to model that collective responsibility. We can coach educators to help achieve goals. We have the growth mindset regardless. They need to be just as accountable as educators are. They need to continue to have, go through with their commitments. We need to make sure that we're giving that time and helping with resources that are for students. And we're going to use all the data for growth. As educators, we want to use a wide array of data, right? We want to make sure that we're looking at data that will help us figure out if our students are meeting their goals. We want to articulate what those outcomes should be. We want to make sure that we're looking at those supported practices and learning from one another. We want to talk about what's successful, what isn't successful. The ego goes out the door. Nobody should be judging anybody for the way that they're teaching. We're all doing our best, and we're going to work together to continuously improve. Again, opening up our classrooms to colleagues, making sure that that communication is constant. We're going to hold each other accountable and help us support our students as a whole. And we're going to protect team time and use it effectively and make sure that we are acknowledging and celebrating successes, however big or small. I can see that there's questions. I know you unmuted, Marissa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a few questions specifically about teaming. So I'm just going to read through them if that's okay, and you can answer them. So for educators in the building who don't teach a specific core class, so English, math, social studies, or science, where might they fit in teams, and how can they be included?
So specifically, if we're talking about like a unified arts, like art, PE, if you don't have any other teachers in the building where you're able to collaborate with them, a lot of times they have a unified arts team or a specialist team, and they're at least able to talk to each other about what they're seeing in their different classrooms. They're able to look at notes from different grade levels to see if they can divide and conquer, if there's anything they can be doing in their particular classes that can help support. If you're talking about maybe like Title I or special ed or things, people like that, they should be part of at some point a team, whether it be, doesn't necessarily need to happen every week, but there should be a certain amount of time where special ed or Title I folks are brought into those professional learning communities and those particular teams so that they can be a part of the discussion because they have really great insight and information about student learning as well. So I'm not sure if they're talking about those types of folks. If you're talking about somebody different, let me know, and I can kind of help you out with that.
Yeah, just I think the UA team was more of it. And just they have really nothing else in common besides teaching all the same or having all the same students. So I
Mhm.
don't know if they're looking for like a goal for the UA team or if they're more helping with the ELA teams and math teams with their goals.
Certainly they can create goals that have to do with their particular teaching, right? So they can help each other figure out goals, whether it be a physical education goal. Like as an art teacher, I might not have a lot of information about PE, but if a physical education teacher lets me know about their standards and where students are at, I might be able to help them figure out a measurable goal for it, just from what I know about goal setting for my own particular content area. It's just like if I teach math, and let's say I'm in middle school and I'm on a seventh grade team. The seventh grade team might be all like interdisciplinary, it might be all different folks. And just because I teach math or I teach reading or whatever, doesn't mean that I can't then look at data or help those other folks figure out what they might be able to do for goals and to be able to look at data and interpret the data for that as well. So there's a little bit of give and take. Specialists, I know it's hard for you because what also happens is we all know that when a lot of these meetings are happening, they are in your class. So it's very difficult for you to be a part of a grade level or a content area professional learning community, but you might be one that's on a school level team or a district level team that's looking at data that's overall. So I don't feel like specialists or UA folks should be left out of the conversation.
Awesome. Sarah, if you want to stay on and continue asking questions, definitely. At the end, I think we'll be able to get into more detail about exactly um what questions you may have. Heather, the other question would be, so what for a team that's already established, that might be struggling, for example, an individual who does not buy into the process and haven't seen the positive results yet, what strategies are there for bringing that struggling team together?
There's been a couple of different strategies. Some are easier than others. Those collaborative agreements, it sounds ridiculous, but if you have somebody who is the negative Nelly and is always like basically saying, we can't do this, we're not going to do this, the students can't learn this, whatever it is, you create a norm or an agreement that says this team will stay positive and look at figuring out how to solve problems rather than to just complain about the problems. I'm trying to like off the top of my head, think about exactly how to word it. But what happens is if you create a norm or an agreement that states that, then you have somebody in that particular group that will be sort of the norm person for the day. And anytime somebody is going against the norms, it's not personal. It's just, again, remember our norms. We're going to be, moving on. We're going to be trying to solve problems rather than complain about it. So we're just going to move on from that. And it sort of takes that, it will stop that person. It might take a little bit, but I have seen it work really effectively to have any sort of norm or agreement that is making sure that people stay positive. I know that one person can just derail the whole thing. It's really hard when you have strong personalities like that.
Mm, Awesome. Ryan, I believe Heather answered the question about special ed teams. If we didn't go into if we didn't go into too much detail, you have a few more questions, we can definitely answer them at the end. But we'll move on to the next section just to make sure we can get through our presentation today. But I believe those are pretty much the questions for now, Heather.
Perfect. I will pass it on to you.
Awesome.
We'll go to the next.
So now we're going to kind of talk about an overview of a PLC cycle. So we just talked about establishing teams. That's really the first thing we need to do when thinking about, this year-long roadmap we have ahead of us. We are going to eventually go into the year-long goal and to do our data dive cycles and also create our cycle goals. So really what we're diving into here is what happens during the school year, during these instructional cycles. So first thing, we really want to make sure that we're continuing our highly effective core instruction in our tier 1 classes. Heather had talked about making sure we keep our expectations high. So we want to make sure that in our tier 1, we're doing our research-based core instruction, continuing that with our students, regardless of, what we're about to start. So during these instructional cycles, Heather had gone over those 4 driving questions of what kind of defines a PLC. So we kind of wanted to just show exactly what that means in an instructional cycle. So when we think about what we want our students to learn, we're really talking about what are those learning objectives, big ideas, success criteria, I can statements, whatever you may call them. We want to make sure that we are defining exactly what we need our students to learn. And sometimes what we might think a standard is telling us is actually we might interpret it a little differently. So we have some unpacking standards protocols, things like that can help you really define exactly what students need to know. And then we have this question of how will we know when they have learned it? We really want to make sure that we are determining, performance tasks, assessments, formative assessments for common ones, and also rubrics, how we are essentially grading our students. We want to make sure that we have all of that intact before we start our instruction. It really helps you, if you kind of lesson plan and do all that before the assessment, you might not, be teaching kids exactly what, they need. So determining those assessments beforehand is really important. And then we're going to instruct and assess, that continued highly effective core instruction. So making sure we are either designing or reviewing lessons that we have previously done, and we're going to deliver that effective tier 1 instruction. And then of course, we are going to take those assessments and give them to our students. And then the bottom part here, we made them both orange because they really go hand in hand. It says, what will we do if they haven't learned it? And also, what will we do if they have learned it? So these can work hand in hand. Sometimes we have a group of students who might be struggling. We have a group of students who might be, performing really well. Kind of, how are we juggling these students? So this is where we want to examine student work and really think about, for the students maybe who aren't understanding what we're teaching, we want to think about misconceptions that they're having, really getting down to the nitty gritty of like, why are they not understanding this? And then when we are reteaching, we want to make sure that we're doing it differently. So we want to make sure we're adjusting our lessons and instruction for our students. And then we're going to, reteach, deliver that effective instruction again, and assess them. And then for those students who maybe have learned it, we really just are deciding, we're going to examine that student work. We're going to dig a little deeper. We can decide to move on or extend for those students and, really plan for next steps for them. So this PLC cycle, these instructional cycles, this is just kind of a layout of exactly what we're doing. We're doing that highly effective research-based core instruction in our classrooms. We're going to be identifying students who might be struggling or who might be doing really well in our core program. And then once we have those students, we're going to either provide additional time and support to those students until they master those learning targets that we've established for them. And then we will extend for those students who are meeting those targets. But really, we're doing all of this with our peers, this peer collaboration that Heather was really just talking about in those effective teams is we're working together to do this as, our PLC team, as a whole school. These kids are our responsibility. We're doing this together. So this is a document for our PLC cycle steps checklist. So this kind of walks you through everything that you're going to be doing through this PLC cycle. We're really going to go more into these parts in future webinars, but this is just kind of walks you through exactly what you need to be doing. So making sure that when we start this PLC cycle, I know this was a question, if you're on that UA team, making sure that you're communicating. We should always be taking notes and sharing that communication out with administration, with others who, have the same, who can, master whatever our goals are. So really keep note-taking template and making sure we're using it at our PLC meetings. We're then going to give an initial assessment to our students. So if we're talking about the first cycle, we want to start with an initial assessment to really make sure that we know where students are at before we start, really digging into what they need. So these initial assessments, they could be a pre-assessment. You might already have some, or maybe you need to find one that is aligned to the standards you're trying to assess. It could be, if we're talking about cycles 2 or 3, it could be a post-assessment from the previous cycle, or 1 and 2. Any in-class formative assessments you may have, we're not talking about, these like huge assessments, just something that can tell you exactly where kids are right now, or maybe some in-class student work, a writing prompt. Any of these can be your initial assessments to determine, kind of where you're starting in this cycle. Once you're given that initial assessment, you're then going to collect that data and you're going to do a data dive. So this is our data-driven dialogue protocol. We're going to go through this in the 3rd webinar, and it's super helpful to be able to see this process and really, it's our next webinar. We're going to be able to go through this process and you'll really be able to see how we set these cycle goals. Once you've gone through that data dive protocol and you're really able to see where students are at with the specific skills that you're trying to measure, we then can plan for the cycle. So we first, want to think about our tier 1 instruction, because we're really focusing on what do all of our students need, not just what some of our students need. So this is just a planning sheet that you can think about strategies and activities, how you're going to progress monitor students. And then you can also think about, if you have RTI or MTSS in your school, what can you do for those students who need that intervention or extension in a tier 2 or tier 3 classroom. And once we've, gone through this cycle, we're helping our kids try to meet these goals, we then want to post-assess and really see how they did with the extra, whether it was a few minutes extra a day, or we kind of switched up our lesson. How did we get students to really make this goal? We want to post-assess and see how they did with that. And again, we are going to dig through that data, see how students were doing. So we're going to apply the data-driven dialogue protocol. And then we are going to, this is an example of the cycle 1 summary, really talk about, or really the progress towards our goal. What went well? What could we have done differently? We're not going to have all the answers in cycle 1. So, what went really well? What can we keep using? What do we maybe need to tweak? It's really important that Heather had said, no matter how big or small, that we celebrate our successes. It's really important to make sure that as a team we're doing that, and we're finding, little pieces here and there to constantly celebrate. So a lot of times we have questions, what happens in these PLC meetings when we're not analyzing data? So we're just going to talk about a few best practices within these PLC teams. So as we talked about in that instructional cycle, with our peers, we can identify those learning targets and unpack standards for our students. It can be super helpful in really understanding what they need to know. And when we do it together, you might interpret a standard a little differently than I would. And we can really talk about, exactly what students need to know. We also, for common formative assessments, creating them, finding them, or correcting them together, making sure that, for if we're doing a common formative assessment, that any rubrics we have, that criteria is really put in place of how we're going to determine how students are doing. We can review data together. We can determine, which students need reteaching, who might need enrichment, or if you should move on. Sometimes it's hard to make those decisions. So talking with your peers, talking about instructional strategies, sharing new ideas. So, I taught it this way. It went really well. I did this activity to go along with this standard, and students were really able to get it. So making sure that this is that adult learning is making sure that we are learning from each other. And that also goes with visiting and observing one another's classrooms. You can learn so much from that. So we highly suggest that as well. And then, of course, we're reflecting, making sure we're celebrating and always documenting and sharing that communication. And lastly, we're going to talk about getting started. And so this is obviously the first of the year-long roadmap is establishing those teams, like Heather said. So we're going to give you a couple of first steps on, if you're putting these teams in place, or maybe as one of you said, maybe you have these teams in place and they're not, going as well as you hope they would. These are some of the things you can do to help with that process. So really thinking about what are you currently doing for teaming and looking at data within your schools right now. So asking yourselves, what are our teaming, what are our teams like right now? Do we need to make new teams, reconfigure them? Maybe we don't like what we're doing with our UA teams. We want to do something differently. Or maybe you don't have any and you need to start that. And then thinking and asking yourself, when do we look at data within our school year? And really thinking about that as well. So this is that, again, creating agreements protocol. This will help you define those team agreements or norms, really allowing everyone to get out, what they need from the group and what the group needs. And again, they're going to be different depending on whatever the makeup of the team is. And this is where you can list those team agreements, and they should always be posted. So one of those roles was the team agreements manager that could be making sure that they're always being followed. So having them posted, having them in your note-taking template is super helpful. And reviewing them also at each meeting. And then making sure that when we make these agreements, we're taking consideration into, for instance, time. As teachers and educators, we know that time is so valuable, and we need to make sure that we're using the little time we have to make sure that we're helping students. So thinking about time, making sure that we're listening to all of our colleagues and we're taking their ideas in. The confidentiality, that's big. We need to make sure that we are trusting our team members. Sometimes what stays in our team meeting, we need to make sure that that's happening. How we're going to be making decisions as a group, making sure that, I saw that not everyone likes to maybe participate if they don't buy into the process. We need to make sure that that's happening in order for our PLC team to be successful. And then we're keeping not only the students' expectations high, but we have expectations for ourselves and our colleagues, and we're following them. These are just some examples of your agreements for the year. This is also in the binder, so you can take a look at these if you like any. And then also the roles and responsibilities, making sure that everyone is accountable. I know that word, as Heather said earlier, is but making sure that, you know, we're following expectations and things like that. So getting those roles and responsibilities, you know, handed out to team members. Making sure that that note-taking template is in place. We have one that you can customize to, you know, your school. Maybe you have one already, but really every team should be using the note-taking template and making sure that it is shared. And then also making sure that there's no question of, you know, when our team is meeting, maybe what the, what we're doing, making sure the agenda is set. So here's an example again of the note-taking template. We're trying to portray that, you know, it's really important that we're communicating when we can't be at maybe all the meetings, and then a shared calendar. This is just an example of how you can kind of plan what you're doing, not only for meetings, but maybe if you have a common formative assessment to give, or you're visiting a classroom, these are all things that can go on the calendar. So right here is a link to the PLC binder. So this has all of the documents we have today, plus more for the other cycles. It is linked. There's both a PDF version and a Google Doc version. So you can make a copy and manipulate it yourself, or you can print it from the PDF. So when you get this slide deck tomorrow, the link is right here, but you also will get those folders as well. Does anyone have any questions? And if it's not about, you know, what I just talked about, the PLC cycle, if you need to ask more about, you know, the effective teams or kind of the makeup of those teams, you can definitely ask at this time as well. So we'll wait for those. But again, and once you close out of this webinar, a short survey is going to pop up. We would love your feedback. I'm always looking to, we read it, we definitely take it, and we're always looking to improve. And again, with the 3 other webinars for PLCs coming up, we would love to hear from you. So this is just a reminder of when the PLC dates are. Just so you know, we did change it. The PLC series number 2 and number 3, we did switch them. So these are the correct descriptions. The next one, we're going to talk about efficient and effective use of common data to impact student progress on the 21st next week. And here's our contact information. You can reach out to Heather or myself if you have more questions, and also Kristen Crawford from the New Hampshire Department of Education. We have her information here as well.
Right now, I think I'm going to stop the recording, but if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and ask the questions.